for coming out to our webinar today. We are going to be talking about technology solutions to enable growth and still meet your compliance needs. We're partnering with Dizzion to bring you this webinar today. So our speakers are going to be JT Galletto. He's our Executive Director of Cybersecurity here at Richey May Tech. Brady Random, he is the Vice President of Product at Dizzion, and they are our partners for a lot of our cybersecurity partners. We work together with them very frequently with our clients. And then we have Michael Brady, the CIO, CISO at LeaderOne, and he is sitting in the same chair as a lot of you today. So he will be speaking from an industry perspective and as a client, and that will hopefully help add a lot of context to some of the topics that we cover today. So before we get started, just wanted to remind you that a recording and the slides will be sent out to you in a few days after this webinar. Please feel free to forward them to anyone in your organization that you think this, these topics apply to. They'll be able to see the slides and a video recording, which obviously includes the slides as well. If you have any questions, you can type them either in the chat box or in the questions section. I will be answering those throughout the course of the webinar. And then also, I usually stick around for about 10 minutes after the webinar is over. So if you think of something and it takes you a long time to type it or anything like that, if I can't answer it, I'll connect you with one of our speakers afterwards who can help you out. And at the end of the webinar, of course, we'll have questions and answers. So if you ask me a question in the beginning and it applies at the end, then I'll pipe up and ask your question at that time. I think that's it. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass it off to JT, who's going to start off by giving us some background of the current trends in cybersecurity.
So thanks for the introduction, Eliza, and thanks everybody for taking the time today to join us and hear a little bit about some of the different areas of cybersecurity risk, but also how we're addressing that risk and helping organizations control their costs and grow. So for today's agenda, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about some of the different cybersecurity threats that are facing the industry today. But again, we want to look at how we balance our growth with some of these different compliance and cybersecurity controls that we have to expend resources on, as well as expansion. How do we expand our businesses and continue to grow, but meet some of the other challenges, such as the California Consumer Privacy Act. And then also, when we start looking at remote users, how do we handle folks that are handling consumer data outside of the physical walls of our locations? And then lastly, we're going to bring it together and have some real world examples of how this has impacted Michael Brady and his organization. So just a brief overview, what is cybersecurity? And this is something that a lot of people always focus on the technology element. But it really is a combination of people, process, and technology working together to protect the confidentiality of your consumer information. But it's also impactful to the integrity, right? So when you think about the accuracy and soundness of the information that we use to originate loans, it's quite important that we get that right. And lastly, the availability. We're all very dependent on our digital systems, especially when we're manufacturing loans. And so cybersecurity can really impact the availability of those systems. And the reality of it is that this is purely a mathematical game. We have to be right 100% of the time for our systems to stay online, for our data to stay confidential, and the bad guys only have to trick us once. And so that's really the challenges that we're up against. And so when you start looking at the state of cybersecurity, these numbers are from the Verizon Data Breach Report that they released in early April of 2019. But one of the interesting factors is I've been following this data breach report is that typically the second most impacted industry has been financial services, and in the data from 2018 saw a decline, and financial services actually took third place. And I think part of that decline is because of the fact that we're getting better, right? We're really trying to focus on how we protect our assets, which is not just our data, but the systems that support our businesses. And when you look at those numbers, though, 43% of the financial services companies that were impacted during the research were small to mid-sized businesses, right? And that's again, not a big surprise, because the bad guys aren't targeting JP Morgan Chase and Wells Fargo like they target us. And the reason being is that those money center organizations have millions of dollars that they dedicate to their cybersecurity programs and the technical controls that are in those environments. Many of you are probably well aware of a number of different mortgage banking incidents that occurred this last year. And we're familiar with at least 20 IMBs that were hit by ransomware since the summer of 2019. And that's, when you start looking at not just the confidentiality impacts that some of these ransomware attacks have had, it's really focused on the availability piece, right? How do we disrupt business so that people pay? And again, the focus is on mid-market companies, right? Another research group called ESG, they went out and surveyed 400 mid-market companies and found that nearly half of them had an incident that impacted their productivity, right? So it's not just the confidentiality piece, like a data breach. It's really the focus of impacting the systems that run the business. And of those organizations, nearly 2/3 of them had a single security incident in the last year, right? So that security incident is a very broad term, but again, think of it like not just data breach, but was it a ransomware attack that maybe just impacted one LO or one end user, right? And then 1/3 of those incidents were due to the implementation of new technology, right? And that new technology could have been cloud computing, similar to many of the stories that we've seen with misconfigured Amazon storage containers, or it could have been adopting new technology from an acquisition, right? They took over or purchased another branch that was leveraging technology that their internal resources weren't accustomed to. And these are really important factors to consider as you look at your overall technology spend and your cybersecurity program. And where are these attacks really focused? And as I mentioned earlier, right, it's a combination of people, process, and technology. And it's really the people element, right? That human element within your organization is the weakest link, right? And the bad guys know that, and they attempt to leverage that through fraudulent communication, and that could be, phishing emails. We're seeing an uptick in malicious texts that come in, right? Because there's been studies shown that people feel as if you are a familiar individual, right? If you text me, right? You must know me if you're texting me, and that change in venue can catch you off guard, right? So these are the kinds of things that we have to be mindful of, because our employees and ourselves, we're being targeted by these things on a daily basis. And really, it's looking at the numbers, right? 75% of companies that have been infected with ransomware, they were actually running up-to-date antivirus software. And that's an important element to consider, because that's what most regulatory guidelines tell us to do, is get antivirus software. 34% of those companies, it took them a week or longer to gain access back to their systems, right, in their environments, because of their laptops and their desktops and their servers were locked up. It took them a very long time to start manufacturing and running their businesses again. Think about that. could you stand to be down for 10 days, 14 days? Those are the kinds of things that those 20 different lenders I mentioned earlier were faced with over the last 6 months. And as a whole, some of the figures that are coming in for 2019 is that ransomware cost businesses $8 billion. And that's a really large figure, but when you start looking at the average cost of an attack, and it's just the ransom that's paid, that's not the cleanup, that's not remediation, that's not lost production, is around $133,000. Now, I know many of you are like, well, wait a second, I've heard bigger figures about other lenders, and you're right. Some lenders have had to pay larger sums. And a lot of that's driven by the bad guys being more focused and strategic on what kind of companies that they're dealing with to get their organizations and say, hey, this company's this size and they are worth X number of dollars, and so they hold them up for more money. And lastly, when you look at nearly over half of those malicious attacks in 2019 were ransomware, right? So we're not seeing traditional viruses being the mainstay anymore. And all this is coming through phishing, malicious scans, right? This is where the bad guys are knocking at your front door and seeing if you're vulnerable to an attack. And these ransomware issues come in for nearly about 6,000 new victims on a daily basis. So let's talk a little bit about how we can address these risks.
Yeah, and when you look at the risks, and JT, great overview on kind of what's happening in the world today, and obviously we keep up with it more, and from our side of the industry, we're looking at these things every day and getting emails with statistics and all those kinds of things, and what you really look at is what can cause risk, right, and what can increase that risk. And when we look at growth, which is a huge part of the mortgage industry right now, we look at FinServ in general, and it's growing, but mortgage in particular really has a kind of an up and down effect. And you know, if we look 18 months ago, you know, things were a whole lot different than they are now. And in a short period of time, we've gone from a kind of a retract position to an expand position and high growth. And we're seeing more and more acquisitions as well. But any type of growth, whether you're just adding employees, whether you're adding additional locations, or when you're acquiring a company, adds potential risk. And depending on what you're doing, what markets you're serving, what governance or compliance you're under, it's going to add different types of risk. And really, we're a cloud desktop provider focused on compliance. And when you look at those things, there's a lot of advantage that you can get by moving to a cloud desktop type delivery for both the growth as well as the risk and the compliance. And when we talk about cloud desktops, and I always think everybody knows what that means. So for those that aren't as technical, really what that's doing is us taking that desktop operating system and all the applications and software that run on it and delivering that from the cloud. And what you're able to do there is put all the risk, the governance, the security controls around that delivery that's actually sitting in the cloud, and it allows you to expand quickly and contract quickly, but also quickly grow. And grow while still maintaining those things. And I think, JT, one of the things that you pointed out was that people are the biggest part of the process, or the biggest part of the kind of the weakness, I guess, when you look at people, process, and technology. And not only are they, you know, maybe naive to what a phishing email looks like, but even on the other side of it, when we get to the IT departments, they can deploy that technology, but are they maintaining it and continuously going back and reconfiguring it based on what the threats are and how threats are changing? So it's a constant moving piece. I think we've seen that just in compliance when we look at things like CCPA and when we look globally, things like GDPR. But even with CCPA, we've seen Ohio come out with their own privacy acts, the New York Privacy Act, the Las Vegas has come out with theirs. I mean, it's just continuing to grow and grow and grow. And what we've seen from our customers is they'd like to offset as much of that risk as they possibly can and make somebody else responsible for it, and still be able to grow. If we can go to the next slide, I think there's a great example here and might help kind of put some of the things into context. And this is from us doing this for almost 9 years. We're in our 9th year of delivering the service. And what we've seen is that if you do it yourself, let's say you go to expand, or you're going to open a new location, or you do an acquisition, and that's really in that DIY model. If you're going to go and take on the compliance yourself, you're going to take anywhere between 7 and 20 weeks to deploy that. And that 7 to 20 weeks could be varied based on what you bought. It could be based on how compliant you really are. It could be based on what you've acquired. But 100% of it is on you. And that the price scale kind of follows that same thing. Then you can move to what's called public cloud DaaS, or desktop as a service, and that's the industry we kind of get lumped into. And you're going to have another experience there. You're going to speed up a whole lot of the delivery time frame. You're going to reduce your compliance responsibility by a bit. Your time frame to get fully compliant is going to reduce by a bit. But your costs are probably going to be really variable based on your internal talent, as well as how compliant, or which one of the check marks for compliance you're meeting. And then on our side, you get the same time frame advantage, but you move a whole lot more of that risk, and your next deployment is a whole lot quicker. And JT, there's one of these that we're working on together right now that I thought maybe we could look at that, because they're actually in the middle section. They're public cloud DaaS today, and they're actually moving from public cloud to Dizzion. But maybe if you can expand a little bit on what you saw when you went into that customer. Even though they were doing public cloud, the compliance just wasn't there.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point, Brady. And so with that mortgage lender that we're speaking of, there's actually kind of a couple of unique elements there for that organization. One, a fairly young company. I think they've been in business 3-4 years now, and with that, they've seen tremendous growth. Obviously, as many of us have, as rates have been low and volumes have been up. And so, in order to fuel that growth, what they've done is leverage the public cloud and desktop as a service, and trying to onboard and offboard different branches as they work into different markets. The sticking point for them was actually twofold. The first one was literally having the internal technology resources to manage those environments, right? So it wasn't necessarily overly complex, but it was just the fact that, hey, they had limited resources, and taking the time to literally manage and maintain that public cloud option, was time intensive. The second piece of that was the compliance, right? So even though they were in the public cloud, they still had to do all of their vulnerability scanning to meet the requirements for the state of New York. They were doing their own patching. They were doing all of the caring and feeding you had to do for compliance, and that was really driving their costs through the roof, to the point where they're like, geez, we like the flexibility of onboarding and offboarding folks through this process, but the costs just seem so high. Maybe we should just go back to traditional desktops and traditional laptops, and we'll ship things to different offices and things of that nature. But that's where we said, hey, there's a better way if you like that flexibility, and that's when we brought Dizzion to the table to talk to them.
Yeah, and we see that time and time again. We see that folks are needing to be compliant, but need also the flexibility. And both of them don't necessarily marry up with a cost basis, whether they're doing it by deploying desktops and trying to maintain all those physical laptops and desktops, or whether they're doing it with a public cloud option. The amount, it again goes kind of back to the people. Another example of people, it's not just, people not knowing not to click on bad emails, but it also says, I need a certain level of expertise and a certain level of hours from that expertise to be able to maintain compliance. And I think you put it really well, JT, when you said, the big companies are doing better because they've got millions upon millions of dollars that they're putting at cybersecurity. They have cybersecurity teams. They have blue teams and red teams even a lot of times. And it just doesn't work that way for a growing mid-sized company.
No, I think that's spot on. And when you start looking at kind of, what are some of the different things that people are talking about, right? What are trigger words? And Michael, I'd love to get your insight on that too, but it's really, distributed. Hey, as we continue to grow and we've got a lot of different branch offices across the country, how do we manage that? Especially as we scale up and scale down, right? And just the managing of that technology, the data, the costs that come with that. Those are all really, critical pieces. And I don't know, Michael, if you've got anything to share with that, or maybe some
lots. I got lots of stuff.
For sure.
It's I'm sitting here watching this stuff, and I'm just running through my mind of we're in the middle of this right now, and you look at these companies, and including ourselves with LeaderOne, we've got such opportunities for growth, but we lose focus that because the business is driven by our sales force, and a lot of times they don't comprehend that potential security, because when you're bringing on a branch or a new group immediately from a commission base, they want to start inputting loans. Well, you've got to give them the tools to get into the environment, let alone the training and everything and the infrastructure to start building their pipeline and redoing everything from scratch all over again. They're not worried about the compliance piece, the security piece. They need to be in the environment today. And with all of these various big data companies that they're not being targeted anymore. They're targeting us as an example, our industry, because we're the mid-level people, but we're connected to all of this big data. And this is a gateway for them to seize the opportunity, with a lot of times without companies like our size not even knowing what's going on, because they didn't have the resources in play, or they didn't understand the processes to remedy a situation, and it went from an hour to 6 hours to whatever, and now they're in quicksand, and spinning up resources to try to fix that in a very system where you can actually get things accomplished before the entire workforce shuts down, and it doesn't take very long. So we're seeing multitudes of positions where you're creating verticals of cyber infrastructure, hardware, DevOps, and a lot of these companies don't have the technical experience. They don't know what they need to hire for, and then they haven't built their P&Ps to manage their business and to engage that future business and keep everything updated. And then the final piece is, loan officers don't want to be trained. They just want to do loans. And then you've got to have a balance of, making sure that you're your big brother, but you're also an individual that'll help them get to where they need to be. Because usually IT is a very restrictive process, but in today's world, it's got to be a balance between an operations, IT, and a Salesforce team, and it's got to work hand in hand.
No, I couldn't agree with that anymore. I mean, when we see different businesses and where they're struggling, right? A lot of times, some of the feedback we get is that IT is too slow, or IT is not moving fast enough to get our new branches online and things like that. And that's where a cloud solution like this really does come in handy, because it does enable that. And
Yeah,
so,
one of the things too, that I'm excited when we get everything launched over with Dizzion is, you assume as an end user, you email or sign into a portal and submit a ticket. Well, you just assume somebody is waiting there, ready to go when that ticket comes in, and they're going to start working on that. And it's difficult too, because you've got SLAs, you've got procedures, you've got to, investigate first before you engage with that end user and then remote into their system. And a lot of times you can't get a hold of the end user to remote into their system because they won't answer their phone or email. So it's a back and forth piece. But with the real-time dashboards available, you could actually tell the user before they even call what's going on with their environment and fix it, real time, if you need be. And that's where one of the components that we're really excited for in the future.
that is a good point. And Brady, if you want to talk about how you kind of onboard some of these new employees, and then maybe talk a little bit about the visibility you have into that environment, I think that'd be pretty helpful.
Yeah, my pleasure. And really, when we look at that original 6 weeks, that kind of setup time, what we're doing is creating basically different user profiles. So this type of user gets these applications, a different type of user, maybe it's processing gets one type of application, loan generators get a different type of application set, et cetera. So once we set those up, it's just a rinse and repeat. So when you're actually onboarding a new employee, or even a whole new office of employees, you kind of go through this 6-step process of identifying those users, adding them to the right groups based on the roles that they need and the applications that they need. And then in 15 minutes, those desktops are already starting to spin up because we've already done all the pre-work in that initial 6 weeks. The great part about it is one of the things we worked really hard on is the transparency and allowing you to see not only how is the systems that we're providing running, but how are your end users experiencing the system? How are they working? And especially when people are remote and you don't want to expand IT into every single location, or definitely not into their homes if they're working from home, you want to be able to see as much as you possibly can about that end user and what could be causing any performance problems or a bad experience. And so we worked really hard on that so we could show help desks and business unit managers and those types of things, everything down to how is their machine performing, how is the bandwidth in between them and their machine, what applications are they using, what is their idle time even, when do they come on and when do they come off, when do they sign in, sign off. You can see all those things, and from a productivity perspective, one of the nice things is and our customers' help desks are always telling us, is that they can actually see a problem before the end user knows they have a problem, because we do a lot of predictive analysis based on those technical metrics that we're constantly monitoring on that end user session. So we actually stack rank them on how great is their experience and allow the help desk to actually drill into that experience and say, hey, they're having a bad experience, but I already know why. And then they can get on the phone with that end user and say, hey, you know what? You've got, for instance, 42 windows of Chrome open. If you shut down a couple of those windows, it's going to really get a whole lot better, right? Either that, or hey, it's one of the ones that we see or hear, I guess, more often than not is everything used to slow down in the afternoon, and we had no idea why with our remote workers. And they finally pinned it down because that's when the teenagers get home and get on Netflix and their Xboxes, and that's when they take the bandwidth from those remote workers. So it's really interesting. I always call it unexpected benefits, where the customer deploys the technology and then figures out that, hey, there's some stuff we didn't know that we were going to end up getting so much value out of, but now we've gained this amount of productivity, et cetera. And we've got a lot of those metrics, even from, geez, how quick can they access the system, for instance, and boot up their operating system. We're all kind of familiar with the, folks come into work, hit the power button, and then that's when they go get their coffee, because they know it's going to take that amount of time before they get back and everything's ready to go. And we've been able to make, parts of business cases just because the end user can log in less than a minute versus waiting for 10 minutes to get a desktop. So really cool metrics, even what applications they're using or your most used applications, et cetera, that we provide visibility into. And obviously, when we're looking at an industry where there's such low unemployment, gaining workers from wherever you can is important.
Yeah,
and you're exactly right, Brady. Sorry, JT, I was just going to jump in real quick. You know, that workforce, now anybody can work if they've got an internet connection, because even if they have, you know, a subpar or a low end connection, you're using another environment versus what that hardware's capability is. And we're starting to see that in some of these remote areas where they don't have good connection, and or they've got limited resources from the specs on the machines. We're seeing actually better improvement for those remote users to be even more productive. So we're excited to start seeing some of those metrics.
Yeah, and that was one of the things I was going to mention for sure, is when you start thinking about some of the different applications we use in the manufacturing process, right? Some of those apps are somewhat, bandwidth demanding, I guess is the best way to put it. So, yeah, exactly. And so when people are working remote, being able to facilitate that in a more efficient manner is really useful. One other anecdotal story, Brady, I'd love for you to share, because this is one that I always kind of get a chuckle out of, if you don't mind, is kind of that monitoring the hourly employee on is there actually activity, right? Because I know that some folks definitely are like, well, if I'm going to let my employees work remote, and am I going to get that value out of that thing there? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, most definitely, and that's another metric and another view, even live, that we provide through the portal, is we call it idle time, right? When are they not logged in, or are they logged in and not doing anything? That's a big one. And JT, I think you're probably referencing, we have a customer I'm about to get really familiar with, but AARP, I think most folks are familiar with AARP. And they basically use our platform in order to firewall their contractors, and specifically offshore contractors. And then they use us for a couple other things as well. But with their offshore contractors, they had just under 1,000 of those offshore contractors. And we deployed the system and everything was working great. And they came back to us a few months later and said, hey, your system works great and everything else, but we don't feel like we're getting almost 1,000 contractors worth of kind of work out of these guys. And we said, well, have you looked at the idle time inside of the portal? And they said, no. And we said, here, this is how you look at it. They looked at the idle time, and what we found was nearly half of those contractors would log into the system in the morning, log out of the system at night, and never touch a key in between. And so they were actually able to go back to that contractor and say, we need to renegotiate our contract. And needless to say, they've been able to pay for our service for each year just based on that renegotiation. But yeah, you can see the end users. You can see when they log on. You can see if they're actually active. You can see what applications they're actually using at those times. And if you want to, you do have the ability to shadow those end users. And that works great from a coaching perspective. It also works great from an IT perspective if you're trying to solve an issue, because a lot of times you've got a non-technical person that's using the applications, and all they care is if the applications work. They don't want to dive deep into a system, so to speak. And so shadowing sometimes will help that as well, and taking over the keyboard and mouse from them. Yeah, it's definitely added a huge amount of value.
So when you think about that shadowing piece too, right? Think about in your organizations, for those of you that you may be using Compass, and you're trying to troubleshoot a new workflow rule that had been put into production, and maybe it's not working as intended. Being able to have your support staff remotely monitor the results, what's going on there, can be pretty useful. Brady, would you mind sharing a little bit about your customer case story here for a mortgage and financial services company?
Yeah, and this is just one of the companies that we ended up doing a case study with, but this is really pretty common. We'll come into customers and they've grown fast. They've ended up getting a mixture of endpoints, right? Some of those are BYOD because I think we all know that sometimes the folks that manufacture those loans want to do it their way and with their device and those types of things. So that definitely happens. They had a lot of maintenance activities, and in fact, they weren't getting them done, right? And that goes a bit back to the people portion as well, and the hours it takes to actually maintain not just systems, but compliant and secure systems. And because of that, their standards and JT, one of the things you hit on was policy. They didn't even have a real good set of policy defined as well. And for that policy that they did, they weren't necessarily following that. And then since they were doing it all on their own, they didn't have really the flexibility, because just like we talked about in the industry where we've got ebbs and flows and growth and retraction and those types of things, they were constantly trying to balance budget with growth and trying to keep ahead of growth, but not burn the budget. So, and typically what happens on the IT side is you're kind of the last people to know that the company's either acquired somebody or is opening an office, et cetera, and what all those requirements are. And then you've got to build for the height, right? The high period or the busy season. You've got to have all that, whether it's hardware, architecture, software, licensing, et cetera. You've got to have that all ready for the peaks, let alone the valleys. And so we came in with a cloud-delivered desktop solution. We applied PCI compliance, which is at least from most of the industry's perspective, from a compliance perspective, the most prescriptive, but it also flows across so many different types of compliance and check boxes, basically, so many different pieces of compliance for so many different things or different types of compliance.
And on that point, right, I know many of you might be saying, well, wait a second, we don't take credit cards, so why would we be following PCI compliance? And as Brady mentioned, it is probably one of the most prescriptive compliance programs out there. So much so that when you start looking at some of the state regulators, Ohio is a great example where if you've implemented PCI's controls, right? So that doesn't mean you've gone out and got formally certified, but if you use that framework and you show that that's the framework that you've adopted and you're leveraging those controls on a consistent basis, you have safe harbor from civil penalties in the event that you have a data breach from the state attorneys general. Now, there are some other things in there too about their notification timelines and things of that nature that I'm not an attorney and I don't play one on TV, but the biggest piece to highlight there is that states are recognizing the value in that framework, even if you're not leveraging that for PCI. And for those of you that are for credit card payments, and for those of you that might be regulated in the states of New York, Massachusetts, or California, you're able to meet the requirements from a cybersecurity control perspective if you're in a PCI compliant environment. So, don't necessarily discount, PCI as being just for credit cards. It is being leveraged by other regulators as one of the watermarks of a good cybersecurity control framework.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, compliance, I refer to it a bit as alphabet soup, right? Because even if you look at privacy, right, you got CCPA, you got GDPR, just so many of them. And it's nice to have one where you can kind of overlay it, and most people will say, you know what, you're PCI compliant, you might even be doing more than the requirements, right? And there's different levels of PCI compliance as well. And at Dizzion, we go for the most strict and highest level, which is level 1. And that's what we pass through to our customers as well. But with this as well, they got our control center and insights, which is kind of reporting and analysis and help desk tools and all those insight pieces that's part of our product. It's not an extra charge or anything else. And then they needed the performance in order to handle some of the large file formats as well, which we were able to do. Faster onboarding by 4 days. They were taking 5 days to onboard an employee. Once that employee got unhired, they're actually down under a day. It's about 20 minutes from the time that they add that user into the system. They were able to use a lot of their existing endpoints, and then we've got some software solutions to secure BYOD. So if people want to bring their own devices, we've got software that'll actually secure those and verify compliance on them. And they ended up adding no new headcount to IT. That's probably one of the most important things, although they increased their user base by 40%. They didn't have to add a single IT headcount to that. And their earlier projections was just about a year to get to compliance. And they had their audit 3 months after they engaged with us, and they passed with flying colors. The financial pieces, which is definitely important to everybody. We're kind of listed there at the bottom on their analysis, not ours. They got a just under $2 million benefit from it. They were using about 200 desktops. The kind of the bottom pieces is they had, especially some contract business that was on different time zones. And so they were able to repurpose desktops because they don't have to be a one-to-one user. And that's a big thing too with our cloud desktops is you don't have to assign a user to a desktop. You just have to have desktops available for the users. So you have to hit your high water mark, not one for every user. And in different industries, that makes a really big difference.
And too,
Mike,
Brady,
I'm
too,
sure you're getting some of these too. Yeah.
Yeah, and just think of the the upside of repurposing these machines that have just been sitting, inactive for X amount of time. We've got a drawer, well, actually a huge filing cabinet of laptops that are being repurposed to go back out in the field for backups. If machines go down, you got to ship a new machine out, or you got downtime. So we're repurposing probably over 200 machines to be prepped and ready to go to all of our branches as real-time backups. And you just turn them on, go to the website, get them up and running, and they're up and running very quickly.
Well, and
that's a great point. Go ahead, JT. I think you're probably going to talk about the same thing I was going to go to. Go ahead.
Well, as I say, and building on that, right, when you start looking at acquisition, right, so when you take on a new branch, if they're bringing their own equipment, the onboarding time is just that much faster, right, because you can get the secure client pushed out and have them in your environment with minimal disruption to what was going on at that branch. And on the flip side, you can also rest more assured of, okay, as we bring a branch in or out, our data and our content staying in the cloud, it's not copied down to that local endpoint that may still be here in 12 months or so. That's a I think a point to really bring home.
Oh, yeah.
Right now as we're growing, right, as an industry, that as you onboard new branches that might be bringing their own equipment, it's a much easier onboarding timeline.
Well, and I think it's and we often overlook it a little bit, but it's really a solution for the data sprawl issue, right? Now my private data or my customer's private data is sitting on, it might be as many as 10 or 12 different endpoints based on who might have touched it at any point in time. And where with cloud delivered desktops, you don't have that same situation, just like you were saying. The other point for it too is from a disaster recovery perspective. If for some odd reason your remote office loses their internet connection, for instance, they can go somewhere else with an internet connection and work. They're not down for the day.
Yeah, great point. So with the last 15 minutes we have here, I'd like to just ask Michael if there's anything else that he thinks worth highlighting, as well as opening up the panel to questions from the audience, if you will. We're happy to answer any additional questions that you guys might have.
Yeah, thanks, JT. We could talk on this for a long period of time, but I think as the folks in the audience, they look at their how they do business today, it's going to change tomorrow, no matter what you think or what you're going to do, because of the way the technology is pushing that change forward very quickly. More AI, more ML or machine learning environment, which it puts a strain on the infrastructure within your IT help desk. These solutions allow faster delivery, faster implementation, all of the compliance built in for those pieces, so that all the different departments can have a peace of mind when you look at that and say, hey, everything is flowing correctly, everything is buttoned up. We've got the best employee experience that we possibly can, so that they can go out and get more business on that. We've always struggled with the onboarding and offboarding. The user comes on board, and especially in our industry, minimum 120 passwords for a username for a user, depending on their persona or their access levels, and the resources needed to set that up, maintain that, take it offline when we know that they're leaving. That's a big key factor from a risk of a company. Is IT and home office are the last to know of when somebody's leaving, especially in the sales force. They've already started offboarding a lot of their proprietary information, and that puts your company's data at risk and reputation. The workforce efficiencies, the ability for them to work wherever they want to, the flexibility for home life, the flexibility for working more hours because they're more productive. Don't get into the position of the sell point of you're going to watch these users. That's not the point of this. It's giving them the resources and the flexibility to travel. Right now I'm in Florida. My home base is in Kansas, and I'm working. And these desktop as a solution solutions allow you to be anywhere that you want to. We've got closers that work down in Mexico, and it's interesting the long-term and ability for our employees to be that stay with you because you offer this type of technology and that flexibility for that balance. The help desk alone is going to gain significant efficiencies. You can reduce or maintain your FTEs without adding for future growth, because you've got all of these virtual desktops in a cloud-based system, and you can have few level 1, level 2 individuals taking care of hundreds of employees at any given time. So it's a very robust system. When you're talking with your senior management folks or the state and federal auditors. I had the Federal Reserve in the office Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday of this week, and it was interesting, talking with the audience. There were 7 of them, and walking them down through these cloud applications or this desktop as a service, the compliance piece of it, the efficiencies of it. I got the impression that they're going to go back home to their IT department and really push more of that convenience that some of us are experiencing today. But it's a great solution, and it's especially with like JT mentioned, with all of the California, Ohio, all of these states are adopting all of these new requirements, and keeping up on them and maintaining and deploying them, and then making sure that your end users are fully tested and understand what they're doing on these environments really allows the company to maximize its efficiencies very quickly.
I think that's a great point. Michael, if you wouldn't mind, we got a question from our, I guess, studio audience. Was this project difficult to sell to the executive team, or were they excited to make this change when you brought up, moving to a cloud-based desktop?
The compliance team was very excited. The accounting team was not. They're looking at the dollar figures, but when you sit down and you walk them through the return on investment, it makes sense to them because they initially see that upfront cost. But when you explain to them over a lifespan of a user or a machine, and then the infrastructure that actually goes into that endpoint, they really don't understand that whole manufacturing process and the support of those endpoints. Sales was all for it because it allowed them to grow more quickly, reduce cost for hardware, because we push that cost of hardware back to those branches. And so you've got savings of hardware, both in physical costs, operating licenses, maintenance, and then the shipping costs as well too. And the other piece that you kind of look at too is the lifespan of these endpoints. They're not made like they used to. It's like it's a disposable world, and these endpoints are sometimes they're not lasting past 12 months or 18 months, and they're out of warranty. Whereas these solutions, it doesn't really matter. But if you can explain to them, the upfront and then the long-term strategy, it's an easy sell to your executive team.
That's great insight. Thank you. Well, with that, if anybody has any other additional questions, please feel free to submit them. But I believe at this point in time, this concludes our webinar. And again, we really appreciate everybody's time this afternoon. And hopefully, we were able to provide some additional insight into different thought process and methodology to run your business. So again, thank you very much, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Perfect, thanks. And as I said at the beginning, I'll be sticking around. So if you have any last minute questions, I'll stick around until the scheduled conclusion at 1 p.m. Mountain. But thank you to our speakers, and we hope to hear from anyone who got anything out of this presentation or needs help with their cybersecurity and cloud desktop initiative.